Hello, my name is Matt Skinner, and I serve as the Scholar for Adult Education at Westminster Presbyterian Church in downtown Minneapolis. And this is another installment in a series we're producing during the summer of 2020 called Big Questions for a Changing Church. Both the COVID-19 pandemic and also a renewed imperative to combat systemic racism are changing how congregations and people everywhere are perceiving God, the church, and our work in the world. And so weekly, I am interviewing a different theological scholar who will share their perspectives on ways in which, in the current season, congregations can change creatively, think differently, nourish themselves spiritually, and accompany their neighbors more generously. Today, I'm really pleased to welcome Dr. Raj Nadella. He serves as the Samuel A. Cartledge Associate Professor of New Testament at Columbia Theological Seminary in Decatur, Georgia. He is a specialist in, well, the New Testament in general, but especially the Gospels in their Imperial context. He focuses on the New Testament in its economic settings, what life is like in the first century, and what are the ongoing ethical implications of that for us today. He has written for scholars and for students and for preachers in congregations. He currently is co-authoring a book that introduces post-colonial biblical scholarship, and he also is co-editing a work that's due out relatively soon called Christianity and the Law of Migration. He is a member in the Presbyterian Church USA, yay for that, and those of us at Westminster are too. And you've earned degrees both in India and in the United States, so you can speak from a variety of contexts, and that's going to be really valuable. But Raj, welcome, and thank you for spending time with us.
Thank you so much, Dr. Skinner, for those very kind words.
Please call me Matt.
Matt.
If I can call you Raj.
Please call me Raj, yes.
All right, excellent. So maybe we can start with something big. So, as Christians, we're part of a faith that gathers around the crucifixion of somebody who was killed in public at the hands of the authorities in a way that they would have considered perhaps just or deserving, at least the authorities would have. In light of that, what does Christian faith have to say right now, in light of that kind of central episode that we often have sanitized or cleaned up to make a little more presentable? What does the crucifixion of Jesus say to us and who we are and to the world in this current moment?
Great question. Thank you. So in the context of the Roman Empire, crucifixion was the most cruel and also the most humiliating form of punishment. It was a punishment that was meted out often to people that the empire considered troublemakers, rabble-rousers. But it was also a punishment that was meted out to people who committed small crimes again from the perspective of the empire. John Dominic Crossan has often talked about how crucifixion was a pretty common practice, especially in places like Palestine in the context of the Roman Empire. And so here we have Jesus, who was also crucified by the Roman Empire because he was challenging the Roman Empire. And we see that throughout the Gospels. We see that in his preaching when he talks about the kingdom of God as an alternative to the Roman Empire. But Jesus was also doing things like going to the temple and turning the tables. In essence, by turning the tables, Jesus was challenging the economic practices of the religious authorities and by extension, the Roman Empire, because the religious authorities in Jerusalem at that time were working hand in hand with the Roman Empire. And so Jesus was both preaching about an alternative empire, but he was also challenging the Roman Empire. And this was a big no-no for the Roman Empire. There was absolutely no way that Jesus was not going to get in trouble with the Roman Empire. But as Christians, we worship Jesus. who was crucified by the Roman Empire, a victim of crucifixion. And in worshiping Jesus, not just accepting Jesus as an important figure, but in worshiping this crucified Jesus, we as Christians are siding with a victim, a prominent victim of imperial violence. What that means for us, what that has meant in first century, second century context, and what that means for us today as Christians is that challenging imperial violence and identifying with the victims of imperial violence is central to our identity as Christians. So we need to be, as Christians, we need to be in the business of challenging oppressive imperial structures. But when we see police brutality for no crimes or things that the regime might consider crimes, but are in essence not crimes, as Christians, we have an obligation to identify with the victims. If we are going to be worshiping Jesus, victim of imperial crucifixion, we should not be in the business of giving the benefit of the doubt to the empire. We should be in the business of giving the benefit of the doubt to victims of imperial violence. I will also say that as Christians, we should be constantly asking ourselves, are we siding with the empire, or are we siding with the margins? We as church has power in the United States, and how are we using that power? Are we using it to perpetuate the imperial apparatus, imperial structures, or are we using it to advocate for victims of violence? So where do we stand? Complicity or resistance? I think these are some questions that we need to be asking ourselves.
I don't think I've ever heard anybody put it quite the way you did, the language of benefit of the doubt. Like, do we give the benefit of the doubt to the imperial system or to those who seem to be pushing against it or being victimized by it? That's an interesting first step, isn't it? Just to think, where does your mind go first? Is it toward blame? Is it toward compassion or empathy?
Right. Absolutely. Right. And right. And I think a lot of the times when we give the benefit of the doubt, and I say we, in part as a Presbyterians have a lot of power and privilege in the United States. If and when we give the benefit of the doubt to the political authorities, we do it somewhat unconsciously or subconsciously, knowing that the empire is there in the business of maintaining order and status quo. Right, right, and the empire wants to promote peace, as it puts it, but peace often means maintaining status quo. Peace often means maintaining order, and that's what the Roman Empire was doing. They were employing excessive force in response to even the tiniest, smallest crimes, or things that they considered crimes but were not actually crimes. And why were they employing excessive force? Well, as they claimed, in order to maintain order and peace. But whose peace are we talking about?
Right. Yeah, so who benefited from that typically were the people at the top of the pyramid in the Roman system.
Absolutely right. And I think that's something that we as Christians should be asking ourselves today. If we buy the imperial or the narrative of the government that it is absolutely important for the administration or the city governments to use excessive police force in order to maintain peace in the neighborhoods, whose peace are we talking about? Who benefit from it?
Right.
And in promoting peace, what are we turning a blind eye to, or who are we oppressing?
Right. At what price? Right.
At what price? Right.
the question I often get when I talk about that with Jesus is, we're looking back 2,000 years. It's easy to tell who the good person was in that setting, right? It's
Right.
obviously Jesus is the one who is unfairly treated. That the lines between who's marginalized versus empire are not always easy to parse out. It's not always easy to tell. And we sometimes make Rome into this evil empire that was so thoroughly bad or corrupt or gluttonous that it would have been easy to recognize how difficult it was. But plenty of people in the first century probably thought that Rome was a pretty good thing.
Oh, absolutely.
Like today,
Right.
sometimes empires do good things, or at least have potential to raise people out of poverty, but other times they act in their own self-interest. So say a little bit more about that, how we keep track of.
Right. And I think, right, you're absolutely right. People had a variety of perspectives about the empire. Even people in colonies such as Palestine that were subjected to brutal imperial violence. Yes, there were a good number of people who were opposed to the empire and wanted to send them home through various means. But there were also a good number of people who were reluctant to challenge the empire, either because, as you said it earlier, they thought the empire, despite its drawbacks, actually contributed to the economic growth of the regions, because they were investing in infrastructure at the time, right? And because the empire was promoting peace. Right? And there were people who were, this was an imperial narrative, but a lot of the people in the colonies were actually buying that, really subscribing to it. And of course, there were other group of people in the colonies who were happy with the empire because they were benefiting from it. The Sadducees, the religious leaders, for instance, who were working hand in hand with the Roman authorities, oppressing their own fellow members of the Jewish community, and in the process enabling the empire. So empire was a complex phenomenon. Responses to the empire was also a complex phenomenon at that time. And I think similarly today too, people, even in marginalized communities, often have different opinions about the role of the government and the use of police force and so on.
Mm-hmm. So when we look at the New Testament, we see some imperial characters, obviously. Pilate would be the most obvious one. You mentioned the Sadducees. Every now and then some centurions play a role. Jesus has connection with them. They show up in the book of Acts. But for the most part, the characters in the pages of Scripture, well, we have tax collectors too, but for the most part, they are not people who are directly necessarily benefiting from or serving the imperial system. And that's not just true. That's true both with Jesus' own followers and then later on in the church. It appears there are not a lot of really influential movers and shakers in the New Testament churches. Is that fair to say? And
absolutely, right. At least among the followers of Jesus.
Right.
Yeah.
So how do we translate that today, where you can be a member of the church and run for office or be part of a city council or be part of a multinational corporation? I mean, something that's deeply embedded in some of our economic and political systems. And be doing that out of a sense of Christian calling, right? Be doing that out of a sense of this is where God has placed me to do good. In other words, the church today in America, at least most churches or the churches I run around in, have a different kind of relationship to the American system than the first century church had to Rome. So how do we parse some of that difference? You mentioned influence earlier.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I want to address that question from two different angles. First, if we look at the depiction of Pontius Pilate, I should say depictions of Pontius Pilate in the Gospels, because it varies from one Gospel to the other. But I think in general, the depiction of Pilate in both Matthew and and Luke somehow amounts to, Pilate doesn't come across as this evil person. On the contrary, in Matthew's gospel in particular, Pilate is trying to release Jesus, right? And so that he won't be crucified anymore. And finally, when he cannot get his way, at least according to this account, he washes his hands and says, I'm not responsible for it anymore. And of course, there are 200 interpretations of what this account actually means. But on some level, Matthew and Luke too are softening the image of Pontius Pilate in these Gospels. And I find that to be on some level troubling, but on a different level, I find that to be fascinating as well. I find it to be fascinating because what I think Matthew and Luke are doing here with this depiction of Pontius Pilate is making a distinction between the empire and its ideology on the one hand, and the people who work for the empire on the other hand. The empire is evil. Its ideology is absolutely destructive. And yet, even people like Pontius Pilate are sometimes, at least sometimes, capable of pursuing what they know to be truth. Well, Pilate doesn't take it all the way, but at least he is interested in doing what is right. And I think what this means is that, well, if you're looking at Christians today who are in influential positions, who move within those networks, I don't think our response, I don't think my response as a biblical scholar will immediately be to encourage them to not work in those positions. But my response would be to actually encourage them to continue in those positions, but to pursue truth or pursue what they know to be truth. And I think the Gospels do a really good job of making this distinction between empire on one hand and people who are working for that on the other hand. But the second angle from which I want to approach it is Luke chapter 16, the parable of the great banquet. Really quickly, this is a story about how this man, this rich person is hosting a banquet, and he invites the influential people implicitly. That's what the text says. And all of them are beginning to make excuses for not showing up at the banquet. And when none of the invited people want to show up at the banquet, the host is then forced to send his servants out into the streets to invite, I quote, the lame, the blind, the poor, and the crippled, unquote, right? So this is a fascinating parable. Oftentimes it's interpreted as an eschatological parable. God is the host, and people who were invited were terrible people for making excuses to not attend this eschatological banquet. How dare they make excuses was the question that I often heard. But if we look at the literary context of this parable, right before this parable, Jesus is saying to his audience, when you host a banquet, a feast, do not invite the rich and the powerful. Invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, right? And in this parable, though, the host is not inviting any of these people, the marginalized communities in the first place. Only when the rich and the powerful who are invited originally made excuses, only then was the host forced to invite the lame, the poor, the blind, and the crippled. I think what this means for us is that, my own interpretation of it is, and I interpret it a bit playfully, but also in the literary context that I just highlighted. I'm just imagining people in first century getting this invitation, taking out their smartphones, texting each other and saying, hey, did you get this invitation? Do you know who else was invited? Pretty soon they find out that only the rich and the powerful are invited. And these people then decide that they were a little embarrassed to show up at this really exclusive banquet, right? Really, do they really want to be part of this banquet that has no room for the poor, the blind, and the crippled? So they make excuses, right? And which then means that the host is forced to go out and include the marginalized people. I think the moral of this parable is if and when you are invited to an exclusive banquet, you should, by all means, make excuses and not show up. You might miss out on a great feast, but you are opening up the feast to others who would otherwise not have access to this great feast. So I think meals in Luke's gospel are metaphors for socioeconomic structures. And what this means for us 21st century Christians, especially for Presbyterians who have power and privilege, who move within those networks of power and privilege, what this means for us is that we should leverage our power to make a difference and to open up this socio-economic banquet for the communities that would otherwise not be invited to the banquet.
And in that regard, we are in some ways subverting, tell me if I'm right, we're in some ways subverting a system, an economic system that might have tendencies to run in a different direction.
Absolutely.
But in other ways, we might be opening up some values embedded in the system that we've always said we confess or profess, that
right.
About whether it's everybody created equal, right? Or everybody having certain inalienable rights. I mean, all the things that we put into our rhetoric. But
right.
So there's a subversive aspect to that, right? Or there's a way of redirecting or pushing the system in a direction it might not be prone to head in. Is that right?
Absolutely. Yeah, right. And I think one can always say, yeah, as Christians we should not participate in structures of power, but I think that's possible for some, and it's actually even ideal for some Christians. And then there are some Christians who are part of those networks, and I think they should use those opportunities to undermine those very structures in which they are moving. Yes, there is that subversive aspect that you're highlighting.
Are all governments then empires or imperial in the way that we're using that language? I mean, I sometimes talk about empires being not just about, who's sitting in Washington, D.C., but empires are the things that form culture, the things that teach us what's desirable and what's detestable, or right. who has value and who does not, that all of those things are quote unquote, I just did air quotes, I swore I'd never do that, quote unquote imperial. Is that fair to say?
I think so. I think by nature empires are oppressive and hierarchical, and a deeply committed Christian might enter those structures fully intending to not participate in those hierarchical oppressive structures. But because empires are inherently oppressive, it's really, really challenging to push back against that ethos. But nevertheless, that should be the ultimate goal for any Christian who is moving in structures of power.
Mm-hmm. Christianity in some ways is always going to be located in the Roman Empire, right? I mean, even when you think about our creed, Jesus being, born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate, crucified, dead and buried, that some of those early Christian creeds want to make sure we don't forget that Jesus was located in time and space, history, and in economics and politics. So there's something about Christianity that always, I think, bears that. Are there ways in which we still are carrying like first century imperial baggage in our worship or in our beliefs? Obviously, I mean, we have crosses on our buildings, which right away is a symbol of Roman propaganda or power.
Right.
that
Right.
we have now co-opted or remade the symbol into something different. But so that's still there. Are there other aspects of our faith or our practice or our assumptions that
Mhm.
would be surprising to learn just how deeply embedded they are in Roman values?
Absolutely, absolutely. So Eusebius, 4th century Roman, 4th century church historian, in his book Life of Constantine, talks about a vision that Constantine, the emperor, had. This was at the beginning of the fourth century. Constantine was engaged in this battle, civil war with Maximus. And so at this battle of the Milvian Bridge, in Constantine's vision, he sees this symbol of the cross, and then he hears this voice, divine voice, supposedly, that says, "In this sign you shall conquer." Right? This is according to Eusebius anyway, and he claims that he heard it directly from the emperor himself. And so Constantine wins that battle. That much we know for sure. But what all this means is that the cross, which was a symbol of solidarity with the margins that I was talking about earlier, has now been turned into a symbol of triumph, symbol of imperial triumph. And I think in some ways, this is probably the quintessential example of the Roman Empire imposing or leaving its mark and its values on Christianity. In the years before that, but also in subsequent years and decades and centuries, the empire actually actively and consistently co-opted Christianity. And Christianity became a state religion. Christianity, which was opposed to the empire for the longest period of time, has now entered into bed with the empire. But I think beyond that, I would also say we need to be looking at, we can't just be talking about how the Roman Empire co-opted Christianity back then. We should also be looking at how some of our own practices today, worship practices today, might actually amount to perpetuating the imperial values, or at least turning a blind eye to the imperial values. One example that I want to highlight is that in my tradition, in our tradition, I should say, Presbyterian tradition, in the worship, we place a great deal of emphasis on moment of silence, right? It's very important. It's really, really important. But it's moment of silence is not something that we often hear about in congregations at the margins, African American congregations, or in congregations in the majority world, where oppression and economic decline is the everyday reality. There, in such contexts, when people go into worship, they are actually expressing themselves robustly in the presence of the divine. They are making noise. They are expressing their anguish and often anger in the context of worship. I think when people in dominant cultures, when Christians who are part of the dominant culture engage in worship practices that privilege silence over anguish or anger, it's problematic. It's problematic because when we are privileging silence in worship, we are essentially equating silence and order with the divine, right? And who does it benefit? Who does such a phenomenon benefit? It benefits people in power.
Right. This is where true bliss occurs, right? In a moment where you can push the outside world away or something, right? You can control this space in which you're in. That's interesting.
Yeah. I want to highlight one other practice as well.
Please.
The Lord's Supper. the Lord's Supper, right? And in the Corinthian, in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul is upset with several members of the Corinthian congregation for taking the Lord's Supper, for treating the Lord's Supper lightly or abusing it, to paraphrase what he's saying. The wealthy people come to the church and they eat all the food that was there as part of the Lord's Supper, and the poor people who are probably working long hours, by the time they got to the church, there was no food left for them, right? So Paul is upset with wealthy Christians. But having criticized wealthy Christians, he's also saying, let's remember how all this started. And he's talking about the Lord's Supper as it was instituted by Jesus himself. On the night before he was crucified, Jesus takes the bread, blesses it, breaks it, and gives it to his disciples. And he says, this is my body, right? And he does the same with the wine as well. Why is it important that Paul is actually criticizing the wealthy Christians in Corinth, but also calling attention to what Jesus himself did? Really quickly, as it turns out, when Jesus fed thousands of people in Matthew chapter 14 and Mark chapter 7, thousands of people, 5,000, 20,000, depending on whether you count the children and the women, right? When he feeds thousands of people, he does these very same things, which is he takes the bread, he blesses it, he breaks it, and he gives it to his disciples. As it turns out, those feeding narratives in both Mark's gospel and Matthew's gospel are juxtaposed with Herod's banquet. Herod's banquet, right? Herod's banquet, which was intended only for the wealthiest people in the society. And in the very next story, Jesus is actually feeding thousands of people at the margins of the society. So Jesus is performing this miracle where he's reaching out to people at the margins of the society. And he utters this, he does these four things: takes the bread, blesses it, breaks it, and gives it to the disciples. He does the very same thing right before he was crucified. And then he says, this is my body, take it and eat it. What that means is that essentially Jesus is telling his disciples that his body is equal, the bread now becomes his body, because in as much as he had extended that bread to thousands of the people in that feeding narrative, he was actually placing his life, his body on the line for the sake of people at the margins of the society. And so now Paul is reminding the Corinthian Christians of what Jesus did, and he is saying, you should remember why Jesus did what he did, and you should not engage in the Lord's Communion lightly. And I say this because when we engage in Lord's Communion, we often treat it as a ritual, as some kind of ritual only, right? But it's not, it is a ritual, but it's more than a ritual. As it was introduced in first century Christian context, it was also intended to ensure some level of economic justice in the context of congregation. So I want to say to Christians today, we can't just participate in the Lord's Supper and not think about economic disparities.
It would have been such a strange thing for most people in a city like Corinth to eat a meal next to somebody who was not their social equal, right? It would have been such a strange thing. And the church provides that space for that to happen.
Right.
In the context of worship in particular, right? Because
absolutely. Yeah. Right.
That makes me wonder about even now and the way in which congregations are existing by Zoom, or other digital means, and the Lord's Supper. Some are still practicing the Lord's Supper, but it's harder to invite others in, or it's hard to do that with the doors open, so to speak, where anybody could walk in, because it's also a proclamation of, hey, there's free food in here, right? There's plenty of food to go around.
Right.
And I think of all the limits around communion, doing it virtually, one of the most disturbing limits for me is there's no way of inviting in somebody. You know what I mean? It looks like it feels like a closed meal
Right.
when I do it online versus when I do it in person.
Right. Absolutely. Right. Yeah. I just wanted to say really quickly that Claudio Carvallis has just written a book on worship practices in different parts of the world. I would recommend that about what Christians should be doing when they gather together for worship.
Excellent. Good. I have to now. People are going to email me the name Carvalles. I think he spells it Carava.
Yeah.
There's an H in there. H-E-S.
Right.
I'm better with Claudio, but yeah, Brazil, he's originally from Brazil, teaches at Union Seminary, I believe.
Right. Yeah.
Excellent. So what, with the current status of our world, where we're dealing with obviously the pandemic and all of the chaos that has created, as well with this renewed call to pursuing racial justice, we're getting close to the fall, where now the presidential election is going to be creating its own sense of anxiety in the United States and furthering polarization. What does that mean for thinking about kind of the Christian church's identity in the world? We've talked a bit about empire, we've talked a bit about power and influence. We've talked about the changes that took place under Constantine and what that meant. In previous weeks, we've talked about the church's complicity in the Atlantic slave trade and how there were theological reasons generated to validate the enslavement of so many people. So the church's theology has power, right? It validates economics, it validates politics, it validates what society is doing. Are there things you think that we should be emphasizing or amplifying right now?
Right.
When it comes to those things in terms of...
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think you really nailed it when you said the church's theology has power. Edward Said, a Palestinian post-colonial scholar, talks about, and I'm paraphrasing him, what he calls a symbiotic relationship between knowledge and power. That is, it's oftentimes it's the people in power who get to produce knowledge, whether it is books, textbooks, or movies, or whatever it is, right? And they produce knowledge in ways that not only justify, but reinforce existing structures of power. For the longest time, Western biblical interpretation has interpreted texts in ways that either deflect attention from imperial structures or structures of power or racism or slavery, or in a good number of cases, actually, they interpreted biblical text in order to justify those structures of power, racism, slavery, and so on. Sugirth Raja, R.S. Sugirth Raja, a prominent post-colonial scholar, talks extensively about how the biblical texts have been used to justify the empire in other parts of the world, in places like India, but also that happens also in places like the United States. So I say when I talk about this issue in different church gatherings, I say, when we look at this whole knowledge production enterprise, if I might use that word, when we look at this theological knowledge production enterprise, we need to be asking ourselves, are we producing the kind of knowledge that justifies and perpetuates structures of oppression? Or are we producing the kind of knowledge that actually deflects attention from structures of oppression? Or are we actually committed to producing the kind of knowledge that not only calls attention to structures, that not only exposes structures of oppression, but also challenges them, attenuates them? one might say, well, deflecting attention from structures of oppression is not as bad as justifying it. It's not, but by not talking about those problematic practices in the church and in the society, in essence, you are letting them continue. You are letting them maintain status quo. So I think theological education, whether it happens in seminaries or in churches, should be about calling attention to structures of power and challenging them. And I'll also say that an irony in biblical interpretation is that much of the Bible was written, almost all of the Bible, specifically the New Testament, was written in the context of the empire. And most of it was written not only from the perspective of the oppressed communities, but also with the goal of challenging the empire. And yet, Christians, my ancestors and my contemporaries too, have often taken these very same biblical texts and used them to justify the empire. I think that's the biggest irony in biblical interpretation. And that's something that we as Christians need to be attentive to today.
I'd say it's the biggest irony in church practice too, and even our understanding of what 21st century Christianity looks like, at least in certain parts of the world.
Absolutely, right. And again, going back to your very first question, how is it that the church that worships the crucified Jesus actually often lends its power and voice to the governing authorities who are replicating some of those same violent practices in our context today? Right. Another item.
Right. I was struck by what you said about when you talk about knowledge production. We can probably extend that to a church's worship services, or how churches construct their budgets or do their adult education programs or their Sunday schools. That you said that it can't be just simply about deflecting oppression or refusing to participate in oppression. We have to be involved in the work of
challenging stuff, right?
Or challenging it. It reminds me, a lot of people now are thinking about the term anti-racism and understanding that it's not simply there are racists and there are non-racists, but
right.
Ibram Kendi and others are trying to take that notion of non-racism off the table and say you're either racist or you're actively trying to dismantle or oppose racism. And I think if I'm hearing you right, you're saying something similar, that we can't look at our church calendars or we can't look at our sermon schedule or topics and say that it's enough to say I'm not engaging, or I'm not propping up an unjust system. We have to think about the work of, like you said, opposing.
Absolutely. Right. I think when churches with power and influence and with good intentions often are simply engaged in turning a blind eye or looking the other way when oppression is taking place out there. It's great that they're not participating in those oppressive structures, but I think when they fail to lend their resources to anti-racism work, they are actually on some level participating in the work of racism. Yeah. I know it's hard to hear, but I think ultimately that's what it amounts to.
Yeah, it is hard to hear, and I think it's the idea that there's no end in sight, that we're always going to be part of this battle is what's in some ways discouraging, but also at least it gives us a really clear sense of mission and purpose.
Absolutely, right, and challenging racism and ensuring promotion of economic structures that allow people at the margins to grow is in the best interest, not just of people at the margins of society, but it's also in the best interests of people with resources.
Exactly.
Right. That way they can thrive and they can allow other people to thrive even more. Instead of the government focusing on policing unrest, the government can actually focus on more useful practices that are good for all in society.
Right. Let me ask you one last question, and then I'll let you go. As you look around right now across American society, and obviously that's a complex thing, in terms of how the country as a whole is groaning under the weight of the pandemic, under the challenge of combating racism. Do you see a theological challenge that churches are facing right now as you talk with students? I know it's summertime, but as you anticipate more contact with students soon, what are you going to tell them? Like, what do they need to know to be able to walk into theological leadership at this current point in time?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. So, right. So, yeah, I don't know if this is theological, but well, it is on some level. I have been noticing a couple of things. First, a book by, I've been influenced a great deal by a book by Naomi Klein, a Canadian journalist. It's called The Shock Doctrine. The premise of the book, well, she makes many arguments in this book. One of the arguments is that when there are major catastrophic events in any country, people are shocked, understandably. But while people are shocked, people in power and people at the very top are quietly facilitating changes that marginalize people even further. And people at the margins are so shocked that they are often not in a position either to pay attention to the oppressive changes that are taking place or to do anything about it. And I think I would want to encourage my students to be attentive to what is happening at the national level that we are not focusing on because we are so focused on the pandemic, for instance. Is the government undermining the environmental laws in big ways? Is the government changing the national security laws in ways that are irreversible and also deeply challenging to us? So I would want to encourage my students to be attentive to that. But in addition to that, I would also say theologically looking at the issues, it's important for us to look at the big picture out there and what is happening on the national level out there. But it's also important for us to be looking at our own immediate context because God resides in our own immediate context. I've seen lots of Christians really spend a lot of time get upset about, rightly so, about the national issues in the last few months. And that's really, really important. But if we are only responding to the most outrageous events that are happening at the national level, we are raising the bar so high for what qualifies as unacceptable that everything else does not get addressed. And so we should be focusing on our own immediate context, and we should be focusing on the microaggressions that take place in our own immediate context. The small, the little practices that are oppressive in our neighborhoods, in our churches, and so on. So, yeah.
I find that really helpful. Perhaps we've forgotten to be offended by what happens locally because we're so addicted to being offended at what happens on national or global levels. You know what I mean? The bar is so high because of
right.
so outrageous to get our attention.
Right. Yeah, I know. We should absolutely be upset about what happened with George Floyd. That is horrendous. But are we only going to respond when something as terrible as that happens? I don't think that's the correct response.
Right. I appreciate that. You've redirected our vision to look as well, in the sphere of the things that we encounter regularly, and perhaps we have some more control over as individuals or as congregations.
Right. Yeah. A verse that a biblical text that I like on this note is John the Baptist's conversation with the people who come to him to be baptized. So he's calling for repentance, and people, at least some people, want to repent. And then they ask him this question, what should we do, right? What should we do? We see this in Acts of the Apostles too. And John the Baptist says to them, if you have 2 shirts, give one to someone who does not have it, right? And if you are a tax collector, don't collect anything more than what you are supposed to, right? What I really like about this particular conversation is John, I'm paraphrasing John and reading, is essentially saying, yeah, you can focus on the idea of repentance as this big, abstract, grand idea. And that's important too. But what's also important is you should facilitate change in your own sphere of influence, where you can do something about it. Otherwise, you are simply asking for the politicians in Washington, D.C. to change structures so that you don't have to do anything about it.
Yeah, it's, John is known as being this fire-breathing prophet. And then when they finally ask him, what should we do? He gives advice or instruction that anybody can do. Right? It's all within your power. He doesn't say, go storm the gates. He doesn't say, go live in a hole somewhere and deny everything. But he just says, right, act justly where God has placed you.
Absolutely, right.
Well, Raj, thank you so much for your wisdom and your insights. I really appreciate all the ways you've been able to frame the issues for us, and mostly for spending time with me and by extension, the people of Westminster and, the whole internet. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I really enjoyed the conversation.
As did I.